Welcome to the 90th to the 81st of the world's 100 Deadliest Atrocities series. So, sorry for the wait, but I'm pretty busy, so I can't work on this series as much as I want to. But I still like making these videos, so I expect to complete the series, and hopefully more videos, within a year or so. But at my current pace, it'll probably be a month or two between each upload, so please bear with me. But without further ado, let's get into the list. When its king and nobility were wiped out by the Turks at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, Hungary ceased being a viable nation. The leaderless land was partitioned between the Austrians in the northwest and the Ottoman Turks in the southeast. But a century later, Hungarians under Imre Thököly tried to drive the Austrians out of their half of Hungary. After suffering a string of defeats, Thököly realized he couldn't do it alone. Hoping to play one great power against the other, he turned to the Turks for help. His request came at the right time. The elite Turkish infantry, the Janissaries, were looking for a war in order to pick up some quick loot, and a 20-year truce between Turkey and Austria was set to expire. Kara Mustafa, the latest vizier produced by the Kapulu family, and the power behind the throne of Ottoman Turkey, seized the opportunity. He organized a massive spearhead to drive against Vienna. Although the Turks issued their declaration of war in August of 1682, preparing their invasion force of over 140,000 troops delayed the offensive until next spring. Although they knew the Turks were coming, the Austrians dithered about preparing Vienna for a siege. 100 years of peace had led them to neglect their fortifications. Fortunately for Christendom, the Turks dithered as well. When they surrounded Vienna in July of 1683, they dug trenches and waited, occasionally raiding, but never attacking in force, even on a couple of occasions when a useful breach appeared in the enemy's defenses. Under the laws of war at the time, common soldiers could legally plunder a city seized by assault for 3 days without restraint, but a peacefully surrendered city belonged to the Sultan. Kara Mustafa apparently preferred to wait and take Vienna intact for the empire, rather than taking it quickly and seeing his soldiers destroy it. Instead, the Turks stayed busy by terrorizing the surrounding countryside, such as massacring 4,000 villagers in the nearby town of Pertolsdorf. The siege dragged on long enough for the emperor to hire 81,000 East European mercenaries to save Vienna. The backbone of this army was 25,000 men under King John Sobieski III of Poland. Sobieski and his Polish winged hussars swooped down on the rear of the Turkish camp. Since the Turks were overconfident of their success, they hadn't fortified their rear for such an attack, and their camp was overrun. Looking to find someone to blame for his defeat, Kara Mustafa arrested Imre Thököly, the Hungarian rebel who talked him into this mess. The arrest of their leader insulted the Hungarian troops, who now switched over to the Austrian side, taking all of the fortresses in Turkish Hungary with them. Ottoman Sultan Mehmed IV, however, had another scapegoat in mind. He ordered Kara Mustafa strangled for his failure, and his head stuffed and sent back to the Sultan in a velvet sack. The Sultan barely outlasted his vizier. The failure at Vienna sparked a coup in Constantinople, and Mehmed was locked in a dungeon while his brother, Suleiman II, was raised to the throne. However, the new Sultan soon died of natural causes, as did the next. Eventually, the empire came up with a sultan who lived long enough to negotiate peace. With the Turkish side in chaos, the Austrians surged forward across the Hungarian plain. They took Budapest in 1686 and scored a major victory at Mohacs in 1687. The Serbs and other Balkan Christians welcomed liberation from the Turks. However, before the Austrians could fully consolidate their new territory, their troops were withdrawn and sent west to fight France in an unrelated war. Undefended, Kosovo fell to the Turks again, and the native Serbs fled Turkish retaliation. Then, the Turks moved Muslim Albanians into the empty land, which would lead to the Kosovo War 300 years later in 1999. Nguyen Sinh Kung was born in 1890 to the son of a Vietnamese teacher, and he spent his youth bouncing around all the major centers of communist thought: University in Paris, Moscow, and Shanghai. In 1919, he tried to convince the victorious allies of World War I at the Versailles Peace Conference to free his people from French rule. When that failed, he returned to his homeland to organize an independence movement. Before anything came of that, East Asia was thrown into turmoil by the Japanese occupation of the West colonies. But regardless of who was in charge, Nguyen was ready to launch a nationalist resistance. He merely directed the effort against Japan instead. He established a rebel force called the Viet Minh, from which he took his new alias, Ho Chi Minh. The fall of Japan in August 1945 left Vietnam in limbo. Without any Allied troops to tell them otherwise, Japanese garrisons began to cooperate with the Viet Minh on local administration. And after settling into the colonial capital of Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam's independence. Then, in September, nationalist Chinese forces, the nearest allies on hand, arrived to take control. But mostly, they just looted Hanoi and left the rest of the colony to look after itself. Indochina sank into chaos as discharged troops, released prisoners, deserters, and crime bosses scrambled to grab whatever they could before anyone could stop them. In some regions, the harassed and outnumbered French authorities, who were recently released from Japanese prisons, reached agreements with Ho Chi Minh's rebels to restore order. Back in Paris, General Charles de Gaulle of the Provisional Government announced that France was not going to abandon any of its colonies. When Ho Chi Minh heard this, he turned less cooperative about letting more French troops and officials into Vietnam. With a ceasefire in place, negotiations dragged on and tensions escalated, and in November of 1946, the French demanded full control of the port city of Haiphong, but the Viet Minh refused. French warships bombarded Viet Minh neighborhoods and blew apart 6,000 civilians. French tanks and aircraft attacked rebel positions in the city. Door-to-door fighting finally cleared the Viet Minh from the city. As more troops arrived from Europe, France took firm control of all the cities in Indochina. The Viet Minh, however, dominated the remote countryside and ambushed any French troops who ventured too far from their territory. The French tried to deflate the independence movement by reorganizing their colony into autonomous but cooperative vassals. They put local monarchs into each piece of the colony and gave them nominal independence under a sort of umbrella organization called the French Union. In 1949, the communist takeover of China finally reached the borders of Vietnam, which gave the rebels access to a major supplier of weapons. The war now shifted to these border regions as the Viet Minh tried to keep in contact with the Red Chinese, and the French tried to break this contact. In December of 1953, French paratroopers seized and fortified Dien Bien Phu in modern-day Laos, a major station on the communist supply line, hoping to draw the rebels into an open battle that favored the French. Instead, Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap brought the strongpoint under siege. By March 1954, rebel combat troops numbering 70,000 and the 100,000 support personnel isolated 15,000 entrenched French, and General Giap opened his attacks. After 56 days of relentless raiding, sniping, and bombardment, the French wore down and were squeezed into a shrinking enclave. Dien Bien Phu surrendered. This defeat convinced the French government that further fighting was futile. Peace negotiations started shortly afterward and granted independence to French Indochina in the form of 4 countries: Laos, Cambodia, and a Vietnam divided into 2 parts, one for the communists and another for the non-communists. That wouldn't last long. Proper hierarchy was very important to the Spanish colonials. Their society was rigidly arranged, such that the peninsulars, people who were born in Spain, were on top, lording it over the Creoles, people who were born in Mexico but of pure Spanish ancestry, followed by the mestizos, people of mixed Indian-Spanish ancestry, with the pure Indian people on the bottom. After Napoleon conquered Spain in 1808 and imprisoned the Bourbon king, the colonials of Spanish America had no idea who to take orders from. Was it the new king of Spain, Napoleon's brother, or the renegade national legislature that the Spanish rebels established? With so much confusion over who was in charge, Creole power brokers began to wonder if this was the moment to declare independence from the arrogant peninsulars. In September of 1810, authorities in Mexico began to crack down on a list of scheming revolutionaries, so Father Miguel Hidalgo, a Catholic parish priest in the city of Dolores, and the next person on their list, took matters into his own hands. Afraid that the anti-clerical attitude of the French Revolution might take hold in Mexico, Father Hidalgo inflamed the poor into a frenzied mob that demanded racial equality, land reform, and severing ties between Mexico and decadent Europe. The mob began a march towards Mexico City, and soon grew to an army of 25,000 men and women, mostly poor Indians armed with clubs, bows, lances, and machetes. Fewer than 1,000 were equipped as real soldiers. The royalist commander in charge of crushing the revolt, General Felix Carrilla, burned villages, shot hostages, and executed any prisoners he took. On the other side, when Hidalgo's rebels took the wealthy city of Guanajuato, they massacred all of the leading citizens, which caused the Creole middle class to rethink its support for the independence movement. Even so, the rebel army soon swelled to 80,000, and Hidalgo punched through the enemy line at Monte de las Cruces. However, 2,000 rebels died in that fight, and the royalists retreated in good shape. As the offensive dragged on, the rebel force eroded. 40,000 rebels deserted before the next confrontation. Finally, in January of 1811, the royalists solidly defeated the rebels in a battle near the town of Guadalajara. As Hidalgo fled toward the United States, he was caught and hauled back to face the Catholic Church, which excommunicated him, and then the government, which executed him. Phase 2 of the war was more scattered and confusing. Rebel leadership passed to another parish priest, Jose Maria Morelos y Pavon. Reality had dashed the hope that a spontaneous uprising would drive the oppressors from power, so Morelos avoided confrontation. Royalist forces, mostly Mexican Creoles, numbered 80,000, and their strategy focused on reducing the pockets of resistance, one by one. In January of 1812, General Calleja destroyed the town of Zitacuero at the center of a particularly troublesome rebel area and laid waste to the Indian villages around it. The Creole general, Agustin de Iturbide, captured Morelos in November of 1815, and the rebel leader was excommunicated and executed before the end of the year. With the main rebel force broken and its leaders dead, the war devolved into 5 years of guerrilla warfare. Back in Spain, Napoleon was gone, and the old Bourbon kings returned, but Parliament had forced King Ferdinand IV to accept a liberal constitution. This alienated and worried the conservatives, who ran Mexico, and one by one, the generals in charge of crushing the rebellion began to switch sides. In February 1821, General Iturbide announced that he would no longer follow the orders of Spain. After negotiating with leaders of the revolution, Iturbide joined their side and marched against the royalist army, which he beat in a series of battles. The new independent government that Iturbide set up left much of the status quo intact, except that it declared the Creoles and Peninsulars to be legally equal. The Republican ideals of the early revolution didn't last very long. Within a couple of years, Iturbide declared himself emperor. That didn't last long either, and he was disposed of in 1823. A boatload of unemployed mercenaries, called the Mamertimes, seized Messina and Sicily, murdering the town's leaders and taking their women for themselves. Then, the Mamertimes began raiding and extorting their neighbors for loot. At the time, Sicily was mostly under the local control of tribes and city-states, but Carthage and Syracuse had staked out large spheres of influence, and Roman-ruled Italy was within shouting distance across the Strait of Messina. All three major powers in the region wanted to drive the Mamertines out and restore the peaceful status quo, but politics complicated the situation. When Syracuse moved to attack the Mamertines, Carthage naturally took the other side. Then, the Mamertines worried that the price for Carthaginian help was too high, so they asked Rome to help them get rid of the Carthaginians. This quickly escalated into a general war for control of Sicily. The Roman army, veterans toughened by the conquest of Italy, won almost every land battle. But the Carthaginian navy was far superior in numbers, seamanship, and boat building to anything the Romans could do. As a result, they could land fresh mercenary armies anywhere on the island and intercept Roman reinforcements being shipped over from the mainland. The Romans soon came up with new naval tactics that played to their strengths. They turned sea battles into land battles by inventing the corvus, a pivoted and hinged gangplank located at the front of the boat. Rather than rely on the difficult tactic of ramming enemy ships, the Romans used grappling hooks to drag their ship alongside the enemy's ship. Then, the corvus dropped, its spike crashing down and hooking through the deck of the enemy ship. Then, heavily armed Roman soldiers rushed across the plank to slaughter the crew. In 255 BC, after securing Sicily and clearing the Carthaginians off the sea, the Romans landed an army in North Africa. But they were stopped by the 13-meter tall, 10-meter thick wall around the city of Carthage. Then, a freshly hired army of Greek mercenaries and war elephants landed and beat the Romans. The Romans evacuated the survivors from Africa, but a sudden storm hit, sinking 248 ships of the Roman fleet off Cape Pachynus, sending 100,000 rowers, marines, and soldiers to the bottom. It was the worst maritime disaster in human history. The war then returned to Sicily. Now, the Romans had the advantage on both land and sea, but two more unexpected storms destroyed two more Roman fleets in quick succession, giving the Carthaginians an opportunity to hold the Romans to a stalemate. Finally, in 241 BC, by the Agates Islands off western Sicily, the Romans destroyed the Carthaginian fleet, which was bringing supplies to the army. With their last army trapped and starving, Carthage agreed to peace on Roman terms, which included reparations, ransom, and the territory of Sicily. After the Carthaginians, the kingdom of Pontus, which encircled much of the Black Sea and had its capital at Sinope on the north coast of Asia Minor, put up the most stubborn resistance against Roman expansion. In the First Mithridatic War, while the Romans were busy with the revolt of the allies in Italy, King Mithridates of Pontus took advantage of the distraction to encroach on the Roman sphere of influence in the east. After he overran Rome's allied kingdoms of Bithynia and Cappadocia, their refugee kings convinced the Romans to come to their rescue. As soon as the Romans declared war, however, the Pontic army occupied the Roman province of Asia, which is now the western edge of present-day Turkey. Mithridates ordered all the Italians living in these lands, 80,000 merchants, sailors, travelers, family members, and even Italian-born slaves killed, and their property seized. Mithridates crossed over to Greece for another easy conquest, until Rome finally solved its issue with the Italian allies and retaliated. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, now a Roman consul, arrived and beat the Pontics in several battles, killing over 150,000 of them. However, the terms of peace he imposed on Mithridates were light, because Sulla wanted to get home quickly and build up his power base in Rome. The Second Mithridatic War was a border skirmish and hardly worth mentioning, except that it would probably be confusing if the story jumped from the First to the Third War without an explanation. Mithridates started rebuilding his army in order to put down some local rebellions, but the local Roman commander thought this new manpower was going to be directed against Rome. After the first clashes, however, they settled the problem diplomatically. Right before the Third Mithridatic War, most kings in the Mediterranean had come to terms with the fact that Rome was in charge. They cleared every major policy decision with their Roman ambassador first. Monarchs without sons sometimes went further and simply just left their kingdoms to Rome in their wills. But when the king of Bithynia gave his kingdom to Rome, Mithridates declared the will a Roman forgery and occupied Bithynia again. The Roman Senate dispatched Lucius Licinius Lucilius to fix the Pontic problem, but when he arrived, he found the local Roman forces to be an undisciplined rabble, in no condition for a hard campaign. After whipping them into shape, Lucilius systematically destroyed the Pontic army and overran Asia Minor. Mithridates fled east to his son-in-law, King Tigranes of Armenia, who refused the Roman extradition requests. In 69 BC, Lucilius fought his way into Armenia by way of the Upper Mesopotamia, with a campaign that killed about 100,000 Armenians. The fortune looted from the Armenian capital of Tigranocerta made Lucilius the richest man in Rome. Mithridates now fled to his land on the north shore of the Black Sea, where his son, Machaerus, ruled. But Machaerus did not want to antagonize Rome and refused to take up arms. Never a sentimentalist, Mithridates killed Machaerus and took personal control of his territory. In Asia Minor, Lucilius made enemies among his fellow countrymen as he consolidated control of Rome's conquests. To relieve the crushing poverty of these war-torn lands, he unilaterally abolished some of the heaviest debts that the colonials owed to Roman moneylenders. This angered many powerful financiers. His soldiers also disliked Lucilius for being a complete loot whore, so they refused to go any further during his latest campaign. This opened the door for a Pontic counteroffensive to reclaim much of Mithridates' lost territory. Lucilius' enemies in Rome took this opportunity to have him recalled and replaced by Pompey in 66 BC, who then grabbed all of the glory by administering the last blow to the dying kingdom of Pontus. As the world closed in around him, Mithridates poisoned his daughters and wives to keep them from being captured and humiliated. He then tried to kill himself by poison, but this failed because he had spent a lifetime developing immunity to the poisons commonly used by assassins. Finally, one of his generals finished the job by stabbing him with a sword. In the escalating quarrel between King Charles of England and the Puritans of Parliament, the Catholics of Ireland were royalists. In 1641, just before the outbreak of hostilities in England, a rumor swept through the Irish Catholics that Parliament was planning to crack down on them at any minute. The Catholics decided to strike first and destroy the Ulster Protestants, who would be the foot soldiers in any such oppression. 3,000 Protestants were massacred in a sudden uprising, and another 8,000 died after they were driven homeless out into the cold. Civil war broke out in England before any retaliation could take place. Unfortunately for the Irish, the English Civil War ended with the king dead and the commander of the parliamentary army, Oliver Cromwell, as the dictator of England. In August of 1649, Cromwell crossed over to Ireland to settle scores with the Catholics, whom he hated even before the Ulster Protestant massacre. Misery and desolation, blood and ruin shall befall them, Cromwell promised, and I shall rejoice to exercise the utmost severity against them. He besieged the town of Drogheda on the east coast of Ireland, and when the English breached the walls after several fierce assaults, Cromwell's army gave no mercy. The English massacred 3,500 people, including all of the soldiers in the garrison, and 1,000 government officials, priests, and other dangerous civilians. The royalist governor of the town was beaten to death with his own wooden leg by soldiers who had heard a rumor that the leg would split open and spill gold coins. Survivors of the massacre were shipped out and sold to plantations in Barbados. Cromwell then moved south, where resistance from the port cities of Wexford led to another slaughtered garrison and a plundered town. As more towns fell to the English sieges, the Irish turned to guerrilla warfare and were able to stretch the war out until 1652. Cromwell left his army to clean up and returned to London. Parliament now decided to break the Catholic hold on Ireland. English commissioners arrived to jail or execute rebels and priests and confiscate their lands. Public practice of Catholicism was outlawed. The English drove the Irish off the fertile land and drove them westward into the rocky part of the island, and redistributed the best land to Protestant landlords and retired veterans from England. Almost 40% of all the farmland switched hands. The island's population plummeted by 20%, as hundreds of thousands of Irish people died of hunger and disease during this upheaval. For the next 300 years, Ireland remained a world of landless native peasants, under the thumb of alien rulers. The Ottoman Turks lost World War I very badly, so the Sultan in Constantinople now lived under the thumb of the victorious Allied powers, who forced him to sign away his empire. The French and the British grabbed most of the Arab provinces for themselves. The Greeks wanted to expand onto the coast of Turkey, where Greek minorities still lived under Ottoman rule. Unfortunately, the Greeks and the Turks were intermingled throughout Anatolia, so it wasn't easy to draw a clean border between them. Greek Prime Minister Eleftheros Venizelos, chief architect of the palace coup that put Greece on the winning side of World War I, landed an army at modern-day Izmir to annex this mostly Greek city that was in the borders of Turkey. About the same time, however, the Turkish general Mustafa Kemal renounced the Sultan and his treaties and tried to revive the sagging nationhood of Turkey. He set up an opposition government inland, at Ankara. In the summer of 1920, the Greek army invaded inward from Smyrna toward Ankara, but their soldiers turned out to be undisciplined and brutal as they crossed the Turkish territory. As reports of Greek behavior toward Turkish civilians filtered out of the war zone, Greece lost a lot of its international support it had enjoyed at the beginning of the war. In October of 1920, King Alexander of Greece died of an infected monkey bite. King Alexander was walking his German Shepherd, and then bam, someone's monkey came in and attacked his dog. He went to help, but then bam, another monkey came in from behind and bit him several times, and the bite wound festered and eventually killed him. So the throne passed back to his father, King Constantine, who had been overthrown in 1917 for being pro-German during World War I. At about the same time, Prime Minister Venizelos lost his re-election. King Constantine was still rather annoyed at having been overthrown, so he purged the government of his son's friends. Most Greek officers in the field were immediately fired and replaced by inexperienced officers loyal to the new regime. The new officers were so bad, the artillery massacred their own infantry. During 1921, the Turks blunted every Greek offensive and fought them to a standstill. The tide turned at the Battle of Sakarya River in August of 1921. A year later, in August of 1922, Mustafa Kemal launched an offensive that broke the Greeks and drove them back to the coast. Bitter in defeat, the Greeks set fire to village after village as they retreated through them, leaving a trail of crispy towns in their wake. The Greeks retreated to the port of Smyrna, trailing thousands of refugees behind them as Greek civilians fled Turkish retaliation. The Greek army scrabbled out of Smyrna, but there wasn't enough shipping to evacuate the citizens. Soon, the Turkish army arrived and began to loot and shoot up the Armenian quarter. Soon, the Turkish army arrived and began to loot and shoot up the city. Fires they set here spread everywhere, driven into the Greek part of town by the wind and the Turks. As the fires swept across the city from September 13th to the 15th, desperate Greeks and Armenians swarmed over the docks, looking for ships to take them to safety. Throughout those nights, Turks arrived to shove refugees off the pier and into the sea, and have, unconsensual relations with the women on the docks. and they stopped only when the ships in the harbor shone their searchlights over them and threatened to fire their guns on the Turks. Officially, 2,000 people died in the burning of Smyrna, but as many as 200,000 Greeks and Armenians disappeared and were never accounted for. The Turks swear the fire was accidental and beyond their control, but coincidentally, the Turkish quarter was spared the devastation that destroyed the rest of Smyrna. Once military events determined that the border was going to stay put, the two countries shoved people around to fit it. In order to remove any excuse for another Greek invasion in the future, Turkey roughly rounded up and expelled all of the Greeks. Greece then decided to make room for the incoming Greeks by expelling all the Turks. Because the Turks ended up in control of all the disputed territories, 3 times as many Greeks as Turks were on the wrong side of the border. Approximately 375,000 Turks and 1.25 million Greeks were uprooted and exiled, making it the largest mass resettlement in history at the time. The Greeks definitely got the worst of the ethnic cleansing, and they were tossed out with less preparation and less room aboard the ships. Athens and Salonika were packed with twice their normal population, and 875,000 Greek refugees, almost 3/4 of the total, required government support to survive. By 1923, mortality among the new arrivals was approaching 45%, as malaria, dysentery, and typhoid fever swept over the displaced people. On September 1st, 1965, a small faction of junior officers kidnapped 6 of Indonesia's top generals. Details are murky, but it seems to have been the first stage in a coup d'etat. When the scheme went bad, the insurgents panicked and killed their prisoners, stuffing their bodies down a well. The sole survivor was General Abdul Nasution, who had jumped over the wall in his backyard and into the yard of the Iraqi ambassador next door after the attack on his home killed his 6-year-old daughter and his aide. After escaping the abduction attempt, General Nasution reported to the senior surviving officer, General Suharto, who had somehow not appeared on the list of assassination targets. General Suharto blamed the PKI, which was the Indonesian Communist Party, and at the time, the world's 3rd largest communist party, for the attempted coup. Many find it mighty suspicious that the plotters had completely forgotten to put Suharto on their list of targets. Not only did he survive without a scratch, the attacks definitely worked out to his advantage. The president of Indonesia at the time was Sukarno, the old freedom fighter who had taken Indonesia out of the Dutch Empire after World War II. In the 1950s, Sukarno had helped found the Non-Aligned Movement, which tried to organize a sort of third world that remained outside of Soviet and American influence. He had begun as a properly democratic president, with elections and a free press. But as the years passed on, he became one of those democratic presidents who were never allowed to lose the election. Members of the Indonesian parliament were appointed rather than elected, under a policy Sukarno called guided democracy. Indonesia stayed calm for a few weeks after the attempted coup of September 1965, but soon, the military began to round up and kill anyone suspected of communist sympathies. All kinds of leftists, not just communists, were killed. Members of trade unions, students, and journalists were also executed. Some were killed in raids that wiped out entire families or destroyed uncooperative villages as well. Other suspects were hauled into local jails to be tortured until they admitted what the army officers wanted to hear. Then, they were taken to desolate spots, where they were shot. According to several US officials, American intelligence personnel supplied the Indonesian military with the names of hundreds, maybe thousands of people they wanted removed. The soldiers and their vigilante assistants also targeted the ethnic Chinese. They had been members of the merchant community that had been part of Southeast Asian culture for generations. On the rumor, they were all agents of Mao Zedong, who was the communist leader of China at this time. Most of the raids took place at night, as masked men came in and took prisoners into oblivion. One eyewitness described hiding in the bushes at night and watching masked vigilantes drive up to the riverbank with truckloads of prisoners, many of whom he recognized as teachers and neighbors. They were dragged out of the trucks and beheaded with machetes. Their heads were stuffed into bags and kept, while the bodies were pushed into the rivers to float away. Almost 500,000 people were hunted down and killed during the Purge. 600,000 were imprisoned without trial, often for years. Thousands were exiled to prison colonies across the archipelago, where many were worked to death. President Sukarno was powerless to control his military, and he officially gave up trying in March of 1966 when he relinquished control of the country to General Suharto, who then served as acting president for about a year until he promoted himself to real president. Suharto eased Indonesia from the non-aligned status and turned his foreign policy increasingly toward the American bloc. Spain never really recovered from the Napoleonic occupation. During the half-century following the restoration of the old regime, Spain was torn by one civil war after another. Finally, in 1868, the Queen was chased away, and the Spaniards began shopping for a new monarch. Its vacant throne was offered to a Prussian prince. France absolutely forbade it, so Prussia grumbled and backed down. France then insisted that King Wilhelm II of Prussia promised to never consider such an offer again, a demand that Wilhelm considered ridiculous. The crisis was almost settled diplomatically, but Chancellor Otto von Bismarck of Prussia noticed that the hatred of the French was the only thing that all of the little nations of Germany agreed on. A large enough crisis might be used to unite the smaller princes of Germany under Prussian rule if everybody got angry enough. So Bismarck taunted the French about the Spanish throne until their emperor, Napoleon III, declared war. Within a few weeks, both armies were drawn up for miles in the open country along the border west of the Rhine. To outside analysts, the war seemed like a toss-up. The French had better rifles and primitive machine guns, but the Germans had better artillery. The French army was more professional with 400,000 volunteers, but the German army was larger, 1.3 million regulars and reservists, mostly draftees, who were mobilized within the first few weeks. In practice, the Germans were in total control from beginning to end. France was crushed in almost every confrontation, until eventually Napoleon III was captured during the Battle of Sedan. With their emperor in the hands of the Germans, the French people proclaimed the return of the Republic and danced in the streets, until they remembered that the Germans were still coming. The French offered to negotiate, but the German price was too high. The French government withdrew to the safer city of Tours in the Loire Valley and scrambled to raise a new army in the provinces. Parisians raised the militia, herded livestock into the city, and braced for the arrival of the German army. The Germans surrounded Paris so completely that the government was forced to send messages and officials by pigeon and balloon. The siege of Paris dragged on for month after month, as the inhabitants ate through their stockpiled supplies, then ate vermin, then zoo animals, and then their pets. While the capital starved, the French government scoured everywhere else for enough spare men to assemble another army. They actually cobbled together two new armies to throw against the Germans, one on the Loire River and one near the Swiss border. Neither made any dent, so France finally gave up. Europe may have lost one emperor with the fall of Napoleon III, but it gained a new one, as King Wilhelm of Prussia was promoted to Emperor of all the Germans. But practically speaking, Otto von Bismarck was the one pulling the strings. Meanwhile, political chaos in France saw Europe's first socialist government, the Paris Commune, come to power in the city. When the national government tried to disarm the Parisian militia, the Commune refused, so the French army moved in and eradicated the communards block by block. As As each pocket of resistance surrendered, the rebels were lined up and shot. 2,000 prisoners were summarily executed during the fighting, and 25,000 random Paris residents were dead in the rubble. The bad-tempered son of a previous dictator, Francisco Lopez, had inherited South America's largest army, along with its poorest country. The conflict erupted because the Rio de la Plata is a broad estuary leading into the heart of South America. Navigable rivers connect the trade of four nations: Paraguay, Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. It's the only place in South America where countries adjoin one another near well-populated areas. So naturally, this is where you will find the bloodiest interstate war ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. During a border dispute between Brazil and Uruguay, the Uruguayan opposition party, the Colorados, joined Brazil for a coup against the ruling Blancos. This made Uruguay a Brazilian satellite, jeopardizing inland Paraguay's access to the sea. Lopez decided to march in and throw out both the Brazilians and the Colorados. At first, a war seemed out of reach because Paraguay couldn't get to Uruguay. The first shots were fired between warships off the coast of Uruguay, but Lopez failed to get control of the sea, so an amphibious attack was out of the question. The only road between the warring sides went through a panhandle of Argentina. When Argentina refused Lopez's request to pass along this road, he attacked anyway in December of 1864, bringing Argentina into what now became the Triple Alliance against Paraguay. 11 million people and 3 countries against a single nation of 500,000. The Paraguayan offensive penetrated deep into Brazil, but Brazil is a vast country that chewed up and spit out the Paraguayan army in a hard campaign. The Allies drove the survivors back to Paraguay in 1866. Meanwhile, the Allies had already begun their counteroffensive elsewhere. By 1865, Brazil had bought so many ironclad warships from Europe and North America that it now had the largest modern navy in the world. The Brazilians destroyed Lopez's wooden fleet in the Rio de la Plata, opening the estuary and rivers to attack. Allied armies and gunboats pushed up the Parana River until they stalled at the Paraguayan trenches, covering the junction of the Paraguay River and the Parana. It took 3 years and over 100,000 lives for the Allies to slug across the next 30 miles, attacking each new line of Paraguayan trenches, one after another. Month by month, year by year, Lopez scoured the country for enough conscripts to fill his lines. Naturally, he shot any of his men who failed to perform his duty to the utmost, and he planted spies throughout his army to report any treasonous utterances by his soldiers. In May 1868, the Allies finally broke the stalemate and drove away the remaining 20,000 Paraguayan soldiers, most of whom were sick teenagers, cripples, and old men. As his enemies closed in, Lopez lashed out against the conspiracies he knew had brought him down. Several hundred Paraguayan citizens, his brothers, brothers-in-law, cabinet ministers, bishops, and judges among them, were seized and executed. He killed over 200 foreigners, including many diplomats. He had his own mother flogged and sentenced to death. By December, the Allies had taken Paraguay's capital, Asunción, and installed their own puppet government. They declared the war won and went home, leaving a small force to clean up. Lopez remained at large, somewhere in the jungle, raising another army of 13,000, including 8-year-old boys wearing false beards and armed with sticks. He embarked on a guerrilla war and grew more and more insane as time passed. Finally, defeated and down to his last 200 men, Lopez was speared by a Brazilian grenadier while fleeing across a river. His mistress, Eliza Lynch, was forced at gunpoint to personally dig his grave. Along with territorial changes that split up much of Paraguay to the Alliance, the war had reduced the population of Paraguay from 525,000 to 221,000. leaving only 28,000 men alive. That's almost 10 women for every man. Polygamy became commonplace among the surviving Peruvians, as the only way to care for the huge numbers of widows and orphans.